I'll make today's spontaneous presentation of the history of evolution, the evolution of evolution, and contrast it a little bit with creationism, although I feel that sometimes the incidence of creationism is exaggerated by surveys with primed questions, potentially questions such as, do you believe God created the world? And if you have such a question in your questionnaire, then you probably lump every religious person in the camp of the creationists, and I think that's an exaggeration. Probably only a very small proportion of responders saying yes would be the sort of people who believe in the world being created in 7 days or in the recent past, or that organisms emerged without the process of evolution. Nonetheless, even a small percentage in society, even 1%, is a worrying sign. So growing in a country with a strong Christian tradition, Greece, my understanding always had been that the position of the church was entirely sympathetic to science and entirely rationalist from the time of its foundation to its present day. And I have been surprised by some statistics floating around the internet, which I have difficulty taking seriously. Now, having said that, and going over the history of evolution, I think I'll start with what is often considered as the beginning of the theory of evolution in antiquity, as pointed out by Darwin himself, and in particular in the philosophical school of Miletus of the 6th century before Christ. Its founder was the philosopher Thales, who had thought that all life must have its origin in water, as water is needed by all living organisms. Perhaps he did not have a theory of evolution in his head when making such a pronouncement, and his writings, unfortunately, have not survived. But it was certainly an interesting proposal and can be taken as the starting point in the development of theories of evolution by subsequent philosophers. And the next philosopher was actually his student, Anaximander, who agreed with Thales in life having emerged from water through the opposing actions, as he said, of hot and cold, that is, through the production and consumption of energy, as we might say today. Extremely insightful. The colonization of the land, according to Anaximander, occurred subsequently through the following intriguing events. It became possible for living forms to encase themselves in a protective cover, an idea perhaps inspired from fossils or from the cuticles of extant crustaceans, or possibly even from the egg shell. It was said then that the first step of colonization of the land by animals permanently living on land, such as reptiles, was through the development of a watertight cover so that they would not die before they were capable of independent living. It is unclear from the surviving references whether he was thinking of the hard-shelled egg or something else. He considered humans to have ultimately descended from fish. And all that is quite remarkable considering the state of knowledge of evolution and speciation at his time. Anaximenes, a student of the aforementioned Anaximander, also of the philosophical school of Miletus, developed these ideas into a proposal that living forms have arisen from other living forms through the action of natural laws. All that was considered 25 centuries before Charles Darwin. Indeed, a Roman philosopher, Lucretius, a contemporary of Julius Caesar, proposed that living forms develop into other living forms by chance, by the chance variation of traits, so that the basic ideas of evolution were already established at that time, with the main question remaining that of how were some of these chance variations selected over others, since only certain types of animals exist, and not all possible animals with any combination of traits, a point also that had been noted by Aristotle. So Aristotle had taken up the idea of why do organisms have only a certain form? Why isn't there a minotaur, half bull and half human, for example? And he argued that, if you have a creature that half of its organs were the organs of cattle, and the other half were the organs of humans, they would be incompatible with each other. And so only certain combinations of traits would be compatible with life. Of course, they were arguing in those ways because, they didn't know about genes and chromosomes and so on. So that was, the end product of genetics. So they were arguing along those terms, but the idea was clearly already there. And Charles Darwin indeed made a reference to these early ideas in his Origin of the Species. These ideas can be rightly considered as the early stages in the development of our present understanding of evolution by natural selection. We can conclude then that the contemporaries of Jesus Christ would have been familiar with the ideas both of rationalism and of evolution. From Rome to the Middle East, these philosophical ideas were familiar to many educated men, as the Greek language had become widely spoken in Egypt, Syria, the Judea, and elsewhere, as can be evidenced, for example, by inscriptions on grave monuments. Indeed, Aristotle and other philosophers had sometimes spoken of a divine cause or a god, singular, who was all-powerful or all-knowing, concepts that also became part of the Christian doctrine. That the ideas of evolution were widely known is evidenced, for example, from the work of two writers who lived at around the time of Christ and shortly afterwards. So for one of them, Miletus, a writer who gave an account of the various religious beliefs at the time of Christ, including those of the Brahmins of India, referred to the ideas of Anaximenes and Anaximander when saying living creatures arose from moisture being evaporated by the sun. In the beginning, man was similar to a different kind of animal, namely a fish. Another Roman philosopher, Aetius, who lived shortly after the time of Christ, wrote, Anaximander said the first animals were generated in moisture, surrounded by a prickly bark or shell, and as they matured, they moved onto land, and breaking out of their shell, they survived in a different form for a short while, as adults, as adult reptiles, or perhaps amphibians, and so on. So two fathers of the church made sympathetic statements, also sympathetic to these ideas, taking the story of the 7 days of creation as a metaphor rather than literally. One of them was Irenaeus of the 2nd century, and he said that God created humanity and all creation so as to grow and develop over time. The first humans were comparable to innocent but morally undeveloped children, not created fully mature. And another Christian writer, Gregory of Nyssa, one of the most important fathers of the church, who lived at the time of Constantine the Great, wrote, Scripture, that is the Bible, informs us that God proceeded by a sort of graduated and ordered advance to the creation of man. After the foundations of the universe were laid, as the history records, the Bible, man did not appear on the earth at once, but the creation of the brutes preceded him, and the plants preceded them. Thereby Scripture shows that the vital forces blended with the world of matter according to a gradation. First, it infused itself into insensate nature, and in continuation of this advanced into the sentient world, and then ascended to intelligent and rational beings. Not just to man. So this account is certainly not at variance with Anaximander or Lucretius, or even our modern understanding of evolution. That is one of the greatest theories to emerge in science. No doubt, the theory of evolution by natural selection of Charles Darwin and William Wallace in the 19th century. Darwin acknowledged that many of the ideas, such as chance variation of the characteristics of species, were known since antiquity. But Darwin developed them further, concluding with his theory of evolution by natural selection, that is, through the survival of the fittest. There were occasional caricatures showing Charles Darwin as half ape and so on, but the fact is that the Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople actually congratulated Darwin for his compelling theory. He called it compelling. He said, "Congratulate you for your compelling theory," asking only that Charles Darwin might consider further how man, being capable of logos, that is of reason, arose from the monkey that is incapable of logos, at least in the sense that apes cannot speak. This was a kind of peer review for the time, and the point became something of an objection, no doubt in view also of the legal status of humans versus animals. So if humans had descended, let's say, from animals, from the monkey or the ape and so on, then there is also a legal question about the legal rights of humans versus animals. So in response, Charles Darwin wrote his second major work, The Descent of Man, where he sought to provide a framework for how language and man's intellect may have arisen from the ape. The quest, of course, continues. There is no final point to knowledge. Thank you for listening.